How are you doing, my rail and vehicle fans? I'm Lex at the Britannic Diesel 312. Welcome to my first episode of Locomotives of History. Now at first I probably should be explaining, what is Locomotives of History? Well, basically what it sounds like, it's discussing certain types of locomotives, steam, diesel, electric, gas turbine, steam turbine, and you know, all of that, that have been created throughout history. We're looking into the best, the worst, the annoyingly average, the mad science ones, the just weird ones, and basically everything you can think of. It mainly features locomotives I personally like the most, but requests about other locomotives are also welcome if I'm able to discuss them well. By that I mean having all the whiz, the information needed, and you know, all of that stuff I need to make a proper documentary. For now, however, I'll focus more on locomotives I know. You know, I always wanted to discuss them, and I thought this is the best way to do it, launching my own documentary series as fan base. I actually meant fan series. Anyway, here's my first locomotive of history, the Pennsylvania Railroad Class S1. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class S1, otherwise known as the Big Engine, was first built in the Pennsylvania Railroad's own Altoona shops in 1939. It cost a total of $669,780,000 at the time, which equals over $14 million in today's money. Yo, that's expensive. But they did complete her just in time actually for the 1939 New York World's Fair. It was not easy to get her there to be displayed, but I'll explain later. I even managed to find footage of her and also managed to colorize it. Shout out to Grizzly and British Railway Films for that. He found it on Pond 5 and uploaded it to YouTube. As you can see in the video, they even built in a mechanism to make its wheels turn static while displayed. It proved to be a highly popular attraction on the fair. But everything good must come to an end, because in 1940 the fair ended and the S1 was removed from the fairgrounds. But the S1 was just getting started, because now she could show what she was built for. As you probably already know, the S1 was more so built as a showpiece and also for speed and power on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And the S1 did just that. Get ready for the big numbers.
While the exact top speed of the S1 is a little bit of a mystery, it is generally accepted that she could go something around 125 miles an hour. Though some sources say she could go as high as 127 miles an hour or even 152 miles an hour at some points. This would absolutely bust the Mallard's speed record. But in the end it mattered for little, because you see, these speeds were never actually officially tested on the S1. So Mallard remains the fastest regardless. But the S1 wasn't done yet, because if you have listened, we are dealing here with a legend. The S1 also proved to be extremely powerful. This locomotive had a total of 7,200 horsepower, which is insane. It had only a tractive effort over 76,000 pounds of force for certain reasons I'll get to in a bit. Because to be honest, that number is a little bit lower than it should be for a locomotive of that size. But again, that's a point for later. The S1 was also insanely popular with crews and passengers. The S1 was well loved by the general public for obvious reasons. Seeing the steam engine was indeed a sight to behold, but there were also her fair share of critics. And that was for a fairly good reason. Keep in mind that the 6100 was a duplex. It particularly being the 6446 made it almost impossible for it to negotiate curves, especially larger ones. While smaller curves, depending on how tight they were, still were pretty much possible to negotiate. The much tighter curves proved to be pretty challenging or in some cases impossible to manage. A much bigger problem was that only 47% of its total weight was on the driving wheels, while the other 53% were resting on its trailing and leading wheels, which is an obvious flaw. This was the very same reason why the S1's tractive effort was only limited to 76,000 pounds due to its uneven weight distribution. In fact, when it was to be displayed on the World's Fair, it had to take a huge detour over the Long Island route. On that route, there were even third rail guards that needed to be temporarily removed. The S1 then had to crawl past that and was even towed backwards by other Pennsylvania freight locomotives. On the trip, it also had to use other railroads' tracks just to get to the fair. Combined, the trip was covering a distance over 50,000 miles. For those not speaking miles, that's over 80,000 kilometers, mind you. Its, as well as other duplexes' most infamous problem was, of course, wheel slip. Though, as History in the Dark and Andrew Alabama's pointed out, which is most likely true, no serious accident ever occurred due to wheel slip on the Pennsylvania S1. The Pennsy later tried to compensate for the problem by distributing more weight onto the S1 by enlarging the sand dome. Insanely, the S1 managed to pay off her operating costs within only a month, which is actually very good for a locomotive like her. Also, while the more common but famous K4 racked up 6,000 to 8,000 miles per year, the S1 managed to do 10,000 in the same time. Unfortunately though, its great steaming characteristics and excellent performance were overshadowed by its design faults. It only ran from 1940 to 1946, after leaving the New York World's Fair when it had ended. What a shame, seriously. It mostly ran between Chicago and Crestline, Ohio, being based at the Crestline Roundhouse as such. There, it had to turn every time it was in town and suffered from repeated derailments like an absolute maniac. Some of the streamlining was later removed to make lubrication and maintenance much easier. It also had 350 grease fittings which needed daily servicing. Finally, the S1 was withdrawn in 1946. It then was stored away while the Pennsy discussed what to do with it further. And while they tried their best to maybe get it preserved, the current situation at the time didn't allow for this to happen. Remember, it was after World War II and the Pennsy were in serious financial trouble. It had been deteriorating so much that the money they would make from scrapping her just was impossible to ignore. And so, reluctantly, the S1 was sold for scrap and cut up in 1949. As you can see, my fellow rail fans, the S1 was a classic example of form over function. It was very faulty, but on a positive note, very eye-catching. And believe it or not, on a railroad such as the Union Pacific, it may have even worked excellently. See, Union Pacific has a lot more straight terrain and much less curvy trackage to worry about. Arguably even straight up ideal for a locomotive such as the S1. Maybe they would have ordered even more of them like they did with the 9000s. Especially since it and the 9000s are pretty close to equal in terms of frame lengths and some other characteristics. UP trackage is also designed to withstand heavier weight, such as the S1 for example. But unfortunately the Pennsy never gave it a try, so who knows how accurate those claims are. In my opinion though, with the S1 we have here an excellently performing locomotive that was simply operated by the wrong railroad. One more good thing that came out of the S1 was that it paved the way for the much better T1s. Most notably, the T1s are much shorter so that they could traverse the entire Pennsy network, and while still being costly were much cheaper to build than the S1. On top of that, the T1s had way better weight distribution and functioned overall much better than the S1 did. The reason why the S1 had a much longer wheelbase than the more reasonable sized T1s, mainly due to its front cylinder sitting behind the leading bogie instead of on top of it like on the T1 and most other steam locomotives. Also notably, the rear end where the firebox was sitting was a lot more compact. All of this resulting in the T1 being a much better and more workable end product than number 6100. Though aesthetically, I honestly like both of them. By the way, the YouTuber Andrew Alabama's, who this episode/video is largely based off, found at some point this rare Photoshop of a T1 with an S1 nose installed, which honestly, I feel like they really should have built. I mean, look at it. Look at it. This so screams of... So yeah, they really should have built that, but it never happened. The S1 also could have lasted longer and been heck of a lot more successful had they tried it out on other railroads. Maybe even convincing them to buy the 6100 from them. That's of course referring to railroads with better infrastructure, such as Southern Pacific, Northern Pacific, or just outright Union Pacific, which are railroads already capable of larger and heavier locomotives, such as Norfolk and Western Class A's and Y's, Baltimore and Ohio Class EM-1s, and even Norfolk and Western's massive steam turbine John Henry. The wheelbase of the tender also could be shortened for the turntable. Or if Union Pacific would have taken a hold of it, they could make a new one to accommodate both the S1 as well as the big boy. Because as you can see in this depiction, despite the big boy fitting technically onto the turntable, it always slightly hang over. Not by enough to be a concern, but it is just a thought of improvement. In other English, with the big boys it just fits, but additionally the S1, the turntable would need an improvement. So much talk about turntables, that my head isn't spinning is a miracle.
In conclusion, the Pennsylvania Railroad Class S1 can't be necessarily seen as a bad locomotive, but rather more as an example built at the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, I hope you enjoyed my video on the matter and or found it informative. If so, then please hit the like button, give the video a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe for future videos such as this. I have a lot more stuff in the works. I'm Lex at the Britannic Diesel 312, and I'll see you in the next one.